Like Angie said, I'm going to be talking about the system design interview tips for specifically for engineering managers, but this is going to be applicable for anybody because system design knowledge is just important in general. Um, I'm going to start a little bit first about a little bit about me. Just like Angie said, I'm her co-conspirator. I also am a director of engineering at Salesforce. As of this year, I'm technically a published author. I worked on a children's book this year that I self-published, and my daughter did the illustrations. You can see a picture of a child reading it in the bottom right picture. It's called What Else Can Samir Do? And it's on Amazon. I'm also a mom to a 5-year-old who just won't sit still. She only sits still when she's drawing, and that's how I got her to do the illustrations of the book. And she absolutely relished that joint project that we did. So, no one person is one thing alone, and I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into what makes me who I am. I grew up in India, as it's obvious, but I moved to for grad school. I moved to LA, and after that, I moved for a job to Santa Barbara. After that, I moved to San Francisco, and I've basically stayed in California for like over a decade, and it's starting to feel like home. um, Something about me that stayed consistent despite all the change that happens within me and outside of me is that I've had a tendency to have parallel interests that I put all my energy in. And when you're in tech, that's really important because you have to stay up to date with what's going on outside. And if you have this natural tendency to stay focused in one stream, that puts you at a bit of a disadvantage. So my default setting to have parallel interests makes it a bit easier for me to also stay up to date and keep my skill set up to date and refreshed. Another thing about me is I always focus on strengthening my strengths. After a few years within my career, I started to do that, choose that tendency instead of strengthening my weaknesses. And that was my strategy, and it remains my strategy. And that's how I continue to do anything that I choose to do. Every year, I pick one focus that's new and I haven't done. And I choose something like I spoke about this year. I worked on a children's book. It's because I really love creating ideas and love to write. And so I wasn't looking to spend that energy on strengthening a weakness instead. At some point, that's counterintuitive, and it's the return on investment isn't worth the time. All right, so I know we tend to talk about system design interview prep when we're not happy with what we're doing currently, when we're not happy with our job right now or our role right now. And I just wanted to start this off by saying when you have, if that's your main motivation to re educate yourself on system design, I feel like that puts you at a disadvantage. So I wanted to say when it feels like the grass is greener elsewhere, there's actually no greener grass. It's all just grass. It's green wherever you water it. So it's you have control over the situation, and make sure that when you're refreshing your skills, it's not just because you're doing it just to get out of a bad situation. It's good to do that regardless. So now I go deeper into the topic and talk about why system design and why is that even important in my role. As I said, I'm a director of engineering and I manage managers and I also manage managers of managers. And as I've grown in my career, I've moved further and further away from playing with code and looking at code even. And so that makes it more and more important for me to understand the fundamentals of system design and then be able to apply that to the kind of decisions I'm expected to make. I have to, at all given times, I have to be prepared to lead technical teams and projects. And it's been a really long time since I've been somebody who codes, and I have to lead a team of people who do that all day long. And not to mention, some of them are extremely senior. They're architects and principal engineers, and I need to be able to ask them questions and have collaborative discussions with them when we're defining how we do projects and when we deliver them. This involves being able to be very, very influential and not to mention accountable for the architectural decisions that are made. If my lead engineer or my principal engineer were to leave a project before it was done, and a new person came in and they started to change the decisions and the design, I'm still accountable for the choices that were made before and the choices that are going to be made in the future. So just because the lead engineer or the principal engineer has moved, that doesn't absolve me from my responsibility. So I need to understand why we did what we did, why we planned to do what we planned to do. And without that knowledge and that basic information, I cannot do that. Another aspect is there's a lot of decisions on what projects to work on, when, and what the greater goal is. And that involves evaluating risks versus trade-offs. So in all, the system design knowledge that you are expected to build up and you must build up, it reflects your ability to lead teams effectively and make scalable decisions. It's extremely critical for engineering managers or anybody looking to be an engineering manager to not think of it as something that's unique to a developer's role. It is very much a fundamental part of being an engineering leader as well. You need to be able to mentor your junior engineers, your senior engineers, and you're not going to be an effective mentor if you can't speak the same language. So, as you're preparing or you're refreshing your knowledge and your skill set for system design, let's assume it's in the use case of an interview. So, there's a multi-step process I like to follow, and I'm going to break it down little by little, and then we can recap it in the end. But this first step is if the interviewer, or even like I said, if it was a project that came to you, you have to first define the problem space. So in the interview setting, for example, you need to understand the problem, and your understanding needs to be then applied into you narrowing the scope of the problem. You need to focus on getting that MVP definition. And it's your job to ask so many questions and as many questions as possible so that you can shrink the scope of the problem, going from broad and vague, because they are intentionally broad and vague, because they want to see you take it from broad and vague to narrow and specific. And you need to do that by applying system constraints. You really you don't want your first step to be you jumping in to show how you can design it. You need to first clarify both functional and non-functional requirements and get clarity around what's in and out of scope. You need to ask questions and state your assumptions and state your decisions to elaborate on what you believe should be in and out of scope, and also ask clarifying questions on the same. Imagine that you're taking your interviewer on a journey so they can see how you think. It doesn't matter so much whether you get the perfect solution. They like to see, because in real life, this is what's important. They like to see how you think about the problem, how you weigh in your options, and how you try to get the right options and the best options. Make sure you're explicitly talking to the interviewer, taking the lead on the conversation, and explaining every step of the journey. Make sure you understand, are you creating a system from scratch? Who are going to be the consumers? Is it a platform solution that has internal and external consumers? What are the pieces, if it's going to be an existing system? What are those existing pieces that need to be incorporated? What are their non-functional and functional requirements? And how does it all tie to the business objective? These are all really important questions to ask because it mirrors your real life behaviors as an engineering leader. It's also important to identify the design constraints because there's going to be a whole lot of things you'll need to discuss. Please make sure to identify what's more important than others and focus on the ones that you think are most critical by asserting that these are the things that are most critical that I will go deeper in. But make sure to clarify why you think it's more important and keep checking in with your interviewer. Just in case they are thinking of it differently, they will nudge you in a different direction. But don't try to make it perfect, like I've said a few times. I'm going to say this a few times in the future as well. It doesn't need to be perfect. Just make sure you move on after answering the question and make sure that you're keeping a track of the amount of data that you'll be dealing with. What are some quick calculations you'll need to do to calculate storage size and bandwidth considerations and such? Make assumptions about user volume and typical user behavior if that's not already clarified. But again, keep checking in with your interviewer. So this is a summary of what I just said. I'm going to recap again, understand the problem, define the scope, don't jump in too soon, consider the key factors, identify and discuss the non-functional requirements, not just the functional ones, and estimate your data requirements. So start high level. Don't try to be going in too deep too quickly. So as you design at a high level, you need to first lay out the most fundamental pieces of the system and draw it out, illustrate how they would work together in order to achieve the desired functionality. Remember, you asserted the constraints at the start. So make sure that the constraints that you have asserted at the beginning are kept into consideration as well. You don't need to go too deep in the details at all. You want to start with designing the fundamental APIs you will need and how the client would access the system resources and so on. You might want to turn those APIs into more APIs. You might want to assert the nature of the APIs and why that's important, the kind of parameters to consider, and so on. This diagram that you're going to draw out is actually going to serve as an indication of the design and highlight the most critical pieces that need to be discussed, especially starting with the functional requirements. Show your interviewer through your diagram how you are thinking about the data and control flow. Don't yet try to solve for scalability. Just give them an idea of how you're thinking about it at first. That's going to come next. All right, now let's talk about going a bit deeper. So here's where we talk about the data needs and the data storage and how to navigate the distribution based on the anticipated load. And here's where you want to showcase how you solve problems and what the approach is. So you want to analyze your system components and the relationships in greater detail. Your interviewer may guide you to focus on specific areas, but don't just rely on them to drive the conversation. You must take the lead. Show that in a real life situation, you're not going to be taking the back seat or the mouse in the room, as the expression goes. You're going to be the person who's most opinionated about the project that you are involved in or impacted by. So you need to go into diving deeper on the non-functional requirements, right? And how it influences your design choices. As an example, how important is it for the end users to see the freshest, latest data? How real-time or near-time does that data need to be? Does this mean we need to be speeding up the data ingestion, the querying? Is it more important for the data to be correct versus data to be reaching you quickly? What kind of a large data storage do we need to have? A little bit of back of the napkin calculations would help here in anticipating the kind of load that one would need to take into consideration in this design. Considering things like, do we need to do partition of the database? What kind of partitioning? How do we balance and query the traffic efficiently? How do you do the traffic distribution? You might need to think about and assert here where you would want to include load balancer layers as well. So here's where you want to present different design options. Once again, you're not trying to showcase the perfect problem. perfect solution to the problem. You're not. You're trying to showcase all the options and then assert which one you think might be the better one. Make sure when you're asserting which one you think might be the better one, you are analyzing the trade-offs and clearly explaining what the trade-offs are, their pros and cons, and why you're justifying, and how and why you justify your choice is very, very important in the logical explanation you provide. They want to see, obviously, how you think, how your critical thinking is, and how your decision-making skills are. So this is the time to do it. So we talked about, managing the data and the load and so on. Once you go into the deep dive of each of your system's components, make sure you take a step, and once you've also explained your choices, make sure to take a step back, almost like you're testing your theory a bit. Evaluate your system's ability and the design that you provided with the various conditions that you all had aligned on at the start of the conversation. Where are any single points of failure, for example? Have you created a situation like that? If yes, how can we work around that to improve the robustness so that there's no single point of failure? Do we need to do things like data replication because the data is that important and sensitive, such that if there is data corruption or data loss, we're in trouble? How important is it if there's data duplication or data replication that there is consistency across all these versions? Is this a system that supports consumers all across the world? Do we need to have multi-geo data centers? We need to keep in mind latency when we are thinking about all of these things. And also, let's not forget some of the edge cases. If you're asked to design a shopping site, there's going to be peak time usage. So we need to bring those things up as well. Shopping during Diwali, shopping during Thanksgiving, has your design taken those into consideration? And during those peaks, or any peak for that matter, how would we support the usage going up 10 times or 10x? Would we do it more gradually, or do we need to do a full migration? And how would we tackle these challenges? So make sure you bring up and apply concepts such as sharding, CDNs, rate limiting, SQL and NoSQL databases, and so on. Step 5 is the review. So you review your design and you wrap it up. So this is basically supposed to be your last step. So you summarize and list all your major decisions and provide the justifications of the trade-offs, and all the choices you've made. Recheck your design requirements if you've covered all the requirements that were defined at the beginning. And if there are any improvements you'd like to bring up, identify and highlight them now. Make sure that you leave time for questions that you might have as well. So don't use up all your time. I want to tell you everything needs a strategy, including how you prepare for this. So I told you what to prepare for and what the interview typically would look like, but how do you do it? And it's no fun preparing and studying when you have a full-time job already. It's difficult, it feels like a drag, but it's going to pay off in the end. And I always tell myself this, that you can do anything for 2 minutes. And then you say that again to yourself 2 minutes later and you keep going. And it feels good when you're all done. It's like a workout, but it's the workout for your mind. So if you're on the fence right now, tell yourself you can do anything for 2 minutes and you can push yourself to get to the virtual finish line on this one. So yeah, I want to just go back and review some core concepts with you that you will need to prepare and take into consideration in your prep material. So scalability, horizontal versus vertical scaling. We talked about if the usage were to bump up periodically over time, are there spikes? You have to study caching strategies and have an opinion based on different use cases. Database choices, like we talked before, SQL, no SQL, how would we do partitioning, how would we deal with replication, load balancers, consistency models, and so on. While I can talk all day long about the knowledge you need to have from a technical standpoint, we all know that's not enough. It's your soft skills and your communication skills. And that's something I brought up a few times, right? It's how you convey your thoughts. So it's very, very effective to focus on your soft skills as well during your prep. So like I told you, make sure you draw out the design that you are proposing. Make sure you convey the trade-offs through your diagram. Don't overdo it with the technical jargon. It's really not necessary. Make sure you clarify your stakeholders and understand what might be important to your interviewer by asking questions. So have the stakeholder awareness you need to have in real life too in the interview, and highlight how the design considerations that you provided will align with the final business goals. Prepare, prepare, prepare. I can't say this enough. Do like actual real life preparation, meet with a friend, practice, prepare, practice, rinse, repeat. It's never enough preparation is sufficient. You know, the more prepared you feel, the more confident you will feel. Take example prompts. I spoke about this earlier, like a designer shopping app, designer ride sharing app, a chat application, and do a lot of whiteboarding with friends. There's a ton of resources online. I'm not going to bore you with those recommendations. You'll find them yourself, but start small with the simplest scenarios and then get bigger. But you'll find in your network so many people willing to help you practice. But there's books and there's courses on Udemy, there's books that are available. Microsoft has their content, and all companies have a lot of resources as well. So yeah, make sure you try an example. The simplest example I like to recommend people start with is a URL shortening service, kind of like a Bitly, where you as a user would enter a long URL and you get the output of the shorter URL. Conversely, the user should also be able to give a short URL and get that corresponding long URL back. So remember, you want to clarify the requirements, make sure you clarify that whether the converse is needed, does the shorter URL need to have a unique alias? How does the redirection happen when you work with you enter the short URL and get redirected to the long URL? What sort of usage are we expecting? Would it be thousands of shortening requests every second, less, more? What is it that you'd like to assert it should be? What sort of service to work with for the redirects? How do should we support custom short URLs? Should we not? Maybe our MVP should be to not support custom short URLs. Should we be tracking click stats and making decisions based on the usage? How long should we be storing these URLs? Should we say that anything older than 6 months needs to be deleted so we can make storage decisions based on that? How fresh does this data need to be? Is it okay if you don't have the latest URL converter, the corresponding short URL for the long URL, like within 5 minutes of it being created? Maybe that's fine. But the system does need to be highly available, right? Anytime somebody chooses to use the short URL, they have to get redirected correctly. So these are the sorts of things you want to think about. You also, like I said earlier, you need to define what the API is going to look like, how the client would communicate with the service, where the load balancer would be, what the application layer would look like, and so on. So as we go into further and further practice, you'll be talking a whole lot about how this conversion would happen, how you would handle a large number of requests, where you would put the load balancers, and so on. What the database would store. Would it store the alias or key and the original URL? Shouldn't it be scalable, the database, to be able to handle numbers of URLs and number of clicks? Maybe it's best to use a NoSQL database in this case. What does caching look like? Because we're reading from the database, it can be slow and resource intensive. We should just add a caching layer most likely. What kinds of in-memory caches could we use here? And like I said earlier, maybe we shouldn't choose to store the URL mapping for too long. What would the cleanup service look like? When would the cleanup service be applied? What the redirection would look like, and so on and so forth. Finally, you also always have to keep into consideration performance and security. So those are the things to consider as well. Common mistakes I've made, at least, that I'd suggest you try to avoid. It's easier said than done, but something to keep in mind. As I said, take your time at the start before you start, designing, ask all the questions, get all the clarity. But a very common one is when we jump into the solution too quickly, we don't communicate clearly, and we're just missing the big picture because we're getting too deep in the details. So these are all the things that are very, very commonly, when I interview people or when I've also prepped, I have noticed I have a tendency to make any one of these mistakes. All right, I'm going to close now with a few thoughts. The success in this system design interview is really, really not about you memorizing every design solution one could have. I mean, I knew somebody who was sharing this cheat sheet, and they had categorized the kind of questions being asked and had recommendations and how you could apply that. But it's not so much about memorizing, because it's going to throw you off in the interview if a different questions asked than you're prepared for. So it's best that you truly understand what you're talking about. But more than that, it's like, how are you demonstrating thought leadership? And based on the directions and the questions being asked to you, how are you adapting your design and how are you responding to change? And then also, it's a way to showcase your deep understanding of these concepts. So, yeah, focus on the trade-offs, align your technical choices and with the interviewer's asks and what they are saying are the business needs as well. I want to remind you, you can do anything for 2 minutes. You can do this too. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I don't know how to stop.
Good questions. How can candidates practice system design effectively if they don't work on large-scale systems in their current role?
You don't need to be already working on large scale systems to be able to prepare and practice. Like I told you, you want to practice with real life scenarios with people who you know or you work with. And the more you think about it in real life scenarios, the more it becomes more ingrained in your mind about how to think about these things. So, yeah, you don't have to be actually working on it right this second. How do you handle situations where architects and lead engineers disagree on technical approaches? Okay, this happens a lot, and this is where you are really have to be very, very thorough with the risks and the trade-offs that need to be discussed. We can't just be talking about the details and not the why about whatever we're proposing. So it's really important that we talk about that as well. And then we just like with any decision, right? We compare the pros and the cons, and if there's a disagreement, we have to either align or we disagree and commit. We can't be in this loop of like indecisiveness. That's not effective for anybody. What did I use to create the illustrations? I used Canva. What's your approach to ensuring junior engineers understand the larger architectural vision? I do think it's really important to do a lot of technical deep dives that the junior engineers get exposure to. It's really difficult for even them to see where they fit in the larger picture. It doesn't just need to be architectural vision, it needs to be product vision. all of everything, like who are the customers, all of that. So if we don't kind of make that transparent to everybody, no one's going to know why they're doing what they're doing. And as a result, they're not going to do a good job they're not going to do the best job they can do. How much should the interviewer help during the system design interview? It really depends on the situation. If you feel like they're going in the right direction, it's worthwhile helping nudge them. Um, but I do think that if you're just seeing that the person just doesn't know their stuff, it's not it's not helping anybody to drag on the interview, and what you think might be helpful is not getting either one of you anywhere. So take into consideration the scenario. You mentioned that you have to be mentoring across the business, senior and junior engineers, but they don't speak the same language, or do they? Do you find that challenging? I think they speak this is how I look at it. I see it as they're speaking the same language, but they may not be speaking the same language as each other. What my job is, I need to be able to um, adapt myself and my communication to each individual. So I'm a mom, like I said, I don't have multiple children. I have just one, but I can only imagine that if I had multiple children, they'd be different from each other. I have to treat each one fairly, and that doesn't mean I have to treat them the same. Treating somebody the same is not the same as being fair. And so this is where I would apply that thought process when I'm communicating. And we need to be staying focused on the design and the right trade-offs that we're willing to make, so that we're all speaking about the same thing. Okay, so the next question is, you mentioned that you are managing managers and also programs and projects. Yes, I do not code anymore. Is it more management and less project program management? So it's all of the above. It's people management that I spend a lot of time doing. I do career growth. I do project management. I do program management. I do roadmap. Define the roadmap in a lot of cases, not 100%, but I partner with my product team to do that. So those are all the things that are part of my role.